Emily, a 31-year-old woman with a talent for accidentally dynamiting her own life, slumped on the threadbare carpet of her cramped apartment, surrounded by a moat of overdue bills. The lights flickered like they were about to give up the ghost, and the faint whiff of burnt toast hung in the air from her latest kitchen fiasco. 7 months ago, she'd been coasting along in a respectable townhouse with her husband David. Now she was broke, single, and wondering how one reckless sentence had turned her world into a 5-alarm catastrophe. The sentence in question? "I'd cheat if I knew I'd never get caught." Emily didn't even remember who she'd been talking. All she knew was that she'd said it out loud, in her own home, at the exact wrong moment. David, her plumber husband with ears like a hawk, had caught every syllable. That one dumb phrase wasn't just a misstep, it was the point of no return. "How could I blurt that out where David could hear?" she groaned to herself, replaying the disaster like a bad movie. "I might as well have handed him a megaphone and said, 'Here, broadcast my stupidity.'" Flashback 5 years, and Emily and David's life had been a safe, if unexciting, bet. They'd met after Emily's string of romantic train wrecks, guys who thought job meant mooching her snacks and hogging her Wi-Fi. David wasn't the swoon-worthy hero of her daydreams. He was a plumber, rolling up in a rusty van with a toolbox and a paycheck you could set your watch to. Not sexy, but steady. Emily, a nurse at a medical center with a middle-of-the-road salary, wasn't exactly living large either. Together, though, they'd managed to snag a modest townhouse in a neighborhood where the garbage got picked up on time and the neighbors minded their own business. At first, things were fine. Better than fine, even. David was a walking fix-it shop, tackling leaky pipes, wonky wiring, and even a bookshelf that heroically held up Emily's stack of untouched self-improvement books. "You've got a good one," her sister Lindsay would say, smirking over a glass of bargain bin wine during their catch-ups. Emily would nod, pasting on a smile, but inside, she wasn't convinced. Sure, David could unclog a drain in his sleep, but he wasn't the jet-setting, heart-thumping type she'd secretly pictured herself with. He was more like a sturdy pickup truck, reliable, but not turning any heads. Now, staring at the bills she couldn't pay and the life she'd torched, Emily let out a dry, raspy laugh that bounced off the peeling walls. David hadn't even shouted when he'd confronted her. He'd just stood there. "Well," Emily muttered, kicking a crumpled bill across the room, "at least I don't have to worry about getting caught now." It was a lousy joke, but it was all she had. Emily's life hadn't always been a solo act in a crumbling apartment. About 2 years before her big mouth sank her marriage, things had started shifting, mostly thanks to David landing a shiny new job. After years of wrestling pipes and unclogging drains, he'd scored a gig as a manager at a company that sold construction supplies. The guy knew his nails from his hammers, and he'd been itching to trade his wrench for a desk. Goodbye, grease-stained overalls. Hello, button-down shirts and a paycheck that didn't just cover the bills, it padded them. On paper, it was a win. In reality, it was the beginning of a slow-motion train wreck. The extra cash could have been a golden ticket for Emily and David. A bigger TV, a vacation that didn't involve a tent, maybe even a dishwasher that didn't sound like a dying lawnmower. Instead, it turned David into what Emily called the budget dictator. Overnight, he morphed from a laid-back fix-it guy into a man obsessed with financial responsibility. Or at least, that's how Emily saw it. He'd hover over their joint account like a hawk, squinting at every transaction. "Did you really need that $4 latte?" he'd ask, eyebrows raised. "We're saving for a bigger house, Em." To Emily, it felt like he'd slapped a leash on her wallet. To David, it was just common sense. After all, he was footing the mortgage, car payments, and most of the utilities, while Emily chipped in for groceries and her own car insurance. The tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Emily didn't mind the idea of a cushy future, big house, white picket fence, the works. But she wasn't about to live like a monk to get there. "Do you really need another pair of shoes?" David would grumble, peering over her shoulder as she scrolled online. "Yes, David," she'd snap back, "because my feet deserve happiness too." She'd earned her money, hadn't she? She wasn't about to let him play dictator over every dime. So in a move she'd later call genius, and David would call sneaky, Emily opened a secret bank account. Just a little stash, siphoning off bits of her nursing paycheck, a safety valve for her sanity. A new blouse here, a fancy coffee there. Small victories she didn't have to justify to Mr. Spreadsheet. In her head, it was payback for David's newfound control freak vibe. She'd mutter to herself, "He's acting like I'm a kid with an allowance." Meanwhile, David wasn't trying to be a tyrant. He was just a guy with a calculator and a dream. 5 years, he figured. 5 years of smart saving, and they'd trade their cramped townhouse for a place with a backyard and a garage that didn't leak. He'd even started sketching floor plans on napkins during lunch breaks, doodling a life he thought they both wanted. If only he'd known Emily was funding her own private rebellion, one overpriced latte at a time. The secret account became Emily's guilty pleasure, like a chocolate stash she didn't have to share. She'd smirk as she swiped her card, imagining David's face if he ever found out. "Take that, budget boy," she'd whisper, cradling a new scarf she absolutely didn't need. It wasn't about the money, really. It was about breathing room. But deep down, she knew the truth. David wasn't the villain here. He was just a guy trying to build something stable while she was busy sawing through the floorboards. And that little secret? It was a ticking time bomb, waiting to blow up right alongside that dumb cheating comment she'd let slip. If Emily's marriage was a pot simmering on the stove, the arrival of Natalie turned up the heat to a full-on boil. Natalie was the new nurse at the medical center, a freshly divorced whirlwind of sass and zero regrets, who swept into Emily's life like a breath of fresh, rebellious air. Where Emily's other friends gushed about David's handyman skills and steady job, Natalie was a one-woman cheer squad for every gripe Emily could muster. Over greasy diner lunches and after-work cocktails that stretched into the night, Natalie became the friend Emily didn't know she'd been craving, the kind who'd nod along and say, "Yep, men are the worst," instead of, "Give David a break." It didn't take long for their chats to turn into a full-blown roast of David. Natalie, with her sharp tongue and a martini in hand, would lean in and declare, "Guys like him are all the same. Give 'em a taste of power, and suddenly they're running your life like a dictator." Emily lapped it up like it was gospel, piling on her own exaggerations until David morphed from a slightly overzealous budget geek into a cartoonish tyrant in her stories. "He practically locks the bank account in a safe," she'd say, conveniently leaving out that she'd been siphoning cash into her secret stash. That little fund had ballooned to $3,000 by now, $300 of it swiped from their joint account under the guise of groceries. She'd almost spilled the beans to Natalie once, her tongue loosened by a second margarita, but she'd caught herself just in time. No need to complicate the narrative. Natalie didn't need the details to fan the flames. One night, after Emily ranted about David questioning a $50 spa day, "He acted like I'd bought a yacht." Natalie dropped a bombshell phrase, "That's financial abuse, Em." The words hit Emily like a thunderclap. Financial abuse? Suddenly, David wasn't just annoying. He was a monster. Never mind that he'd been covering most of their bills while she funneled cash into her private shoe and latte empire. Natalie's diagnosis gave Emily's frustration a shiny new label, and she clung to it like a life raft. Meanwhile, David was clueless about the storm brewing. He'd noticed the chill in their marriage, Emily's eye rolls, her clipped answers, and figured it was time to patch things up. "How about a weekend getaway?" he'd suggest, all earnest smiles, or, "Maybe we should talk about kids soon?" Emily shot him down faster than a carnival duck. A getaway? Boring? Kids? With him? Pass. She'd rather vent to Natalie over nachos than sit through David's latest napkin-drawn house plan. To her, his attempts felt like a trap, another way to tie her down to his dull, sensible life. To him, it was just a guy trying to keep his marriage from sinking like a bad plumbing job. The more Natalie egged her on, the deeper Emily dug in. She'd storm home from work, replaying their chats in her head, and glare at David like he'd personally invented taxes. Once he'd asked, "Everything okay, Em?" while fixing the toaster she'd broken, again, and she'd snapped, "Oh, it's fine, Warden," before stomping off. David blinked, confused. wondering when he'd gone from husband to jailer. If he'd known about the $3,000 secret account, or the fact that Emily was now calling him the control king behind his back, he might have dropped the screwdriver and walked out right then. Emily was done stewing in her marital misery. She needed an escape, and work was starting to look like the perfect playground. One late evening, stuck pulling overtime at the medical center, she found herself alone with Zach, the marketing guy who could have stepped out of a gym ad. Tall, single, and armed with a grin that could melt ice, Zach had a way of making Emily's pulse do a little tap dance. They were sorting patient flyers, thrilling stuff, when he glanced over and asked, "Your husband cool with you staying late like this?" Emily bristled, tossing her hair back with a scoff. "David doesn't run my schedule," she shot back, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Zach's eyebrows lifted, and that flicker of admiration in his eyes. Oh, she drank it up like a double espresso. When she finally dragged herself home that night, the kitchen light was still on. There, in the microwave, sat a plate of chicken and mashed potatoes, carefully covered with foil. David's handiwork. He'd scribbled a note. "Didn't want you to go hungry. Heat it up when you get in." Most people might have seen it for what it was, a sweet gesture from a guy who cared. Emily? She saw red. To her it wasn't dinner, it was a leash, another subtle jab from David to keep her tethered to his predictable little world. She shoved the plate back in the microwave, untouched, and stomped off to bed, muttering about how he just didn't get it. By now their marriage was less a partnership and more two trains chugging along on parallel tracks, headed in the same direction but never quite meeting. David was still trying, bless his stubborn heart. With the 4th of July coming up, he floated an idea over breakfast. How about a barbecue? Invite some friends, fire up the grill. Could be fun, right? He looked at her with that hopeful puppy dog grin, genuinely thinking a backyard party might glue them back together. Emily barely glanced up from her coffee. "Sure, whatever," she mumbled, nodding like she was agreeing to a dentist appointment. To David, it was a green light. To her, it was just noise. Later that day, over a hurried lunch break, she unloaded to Natalie. "He's forcing me to host his boring work buddies," she groaned, stabbing at her salad like it had personally offended her. Natalie smirked, popping a fry in her mouth. Classic David. "Next, he'll have you ironing his shirts for the occasion." Emily didn't correct her, didn't mention that David had asked, not demanded, or that she'd barely listened before shrugging him off. Why ruin a good rant with facts? Meanwhile, Zach was becoming her favorite distraction. He'd linger by her desk with some flimsy excuse, "Need your input on this flyer font," and she'd play along, laughing a little too loud at his dumb jokes. He'd lean in close, all casual confidence, and she'd feel that buzz again, the kind David's mashed potatoes couldn't spark. One afternoon, he'd even tossed out a teasing, "You're too fun to be stuck at home all the time." Emily grinned, brushing it off, but inside, she was glowing. Someone saw her as fun, not a budget line item or a barbecue co-host. David, oblivious, kept planning his Independence Day rescue mission, hauling out the grill and humming patriotic tunes. Emily, meanwhile, was mentally clocking out of their life together, her mind drifting to Zach's easy charm and the thrill of being noticed. The rift wasn't just widening, it was turning into a canyon, and neither of them seemed to realize how far the other had already drifted. The 4th of July barbecue was supposed to be a grand gesture, David's big swing at patching up their fraying marriage. He'd even suggested Emily invite her work crew, figuring a mix of their worlds might spark some magic. "Let's make it a real party," he'd said, all earnest and apron ready. Emily rolled her eyes but sent the invites anyway, secretly hoping Zach would show up and liven up the snooze fest. By the time the day rolled around, their backyard was buzzing with neighbors, David's construction pals, and a handful of medical center folks, all lured by the promise of free food and a patriotic playlist. David threw himself into host mode, flipping burgers like a man on a mission, sweat beading on his forehead as he grinned at guests. He'd splurged on extra buns and even rigged up some twinkle lights, his version of romance. Emily, meanwhile, had taken Natalie's advice to class up the joint and blown a chunk of their joint account on fancy booze. Think craft beers and a bottle of gin that cost more than their electric bill. When David spotted the receipt, his jaw tightened. "This stuff's pricey, Em," he said, holding up the gin like it was evidence. She fired back, "Oh, sorry. Didn't realize you'd turned into the penny-pinching police." He blinked, stung, but let it slide, chalking it up to party stress. The yard filled up fast. David's colleagues swapped work stories over paper plates, while the neighbors cooed over his grill skills. Emily plastered on a smile so fake it could have been plastic, counting the minutes until she could ditch the charade. Then Natalie swept in, late and loud, rocking a dress so bright it practically screamed for attention. She dragged Emily to the makeshift bar, and soon they were knocking back drinks like it was a competition. By dusk, with fireworks popping in the distance, Emily was 3 cocktails deep, her filter long gone. David, sensing the night was dragging, wandered over to the group. "Hey, maybe we wrap up soon? I've got an early start tomorrow," he suggested, voice gentle but firm. Emily snorted, loud enough to turn heads. "Oh, here we go. Mr. Control's shutting it down," she slurred, waving her glass for emphasis. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, but David's smile faltered. He retreated to the grill, brushing it off while Emily doubled down, basking in Natalie's approving smirk. Later, sprawled on lawn chairs with Natalie, Zach, and Mike, another coworker roped into the mess, Emily hit her breaking point. The booze had loosened her tongue, and she let it fly. "You know what?" she declared, voice carrying over the cicadas. "I'd cheat on David in a heartbeat if I knew I wouldn't get caught. He doesn't deserve loyalty. Mr. Serious with his budgets and barbecues." She cackled, then dropped the kicker. "I've got a secret fund, too. $3,000, all mine. Take that, Warden." Natalie snickered. Zach raised an eyebrow, and Mike stared into his beer like it might save him. What Emily didn't see was David, frozen just inside the screen door, a tray of leftover buns in his hands. He'd come out to offer seconds and caught every word. His face went slack, like someone had punched the air out of him. When Emily finally clocked him standing there, her stomach dropped, but not enough to backtrack. Instead, she straightened up, defiance kicking in. "What? You earned it with all your seriousness," she spat, as if he'd forced her hand. The vibe crashed hard. Natalie shifted in her seat, Zach coughed into his fist, and Mike muttered something about checking the time. Emily, undeterred, rounded on them. "Come on, back me up. Tell me he's outrageous." She glared, daring them to agree. They didn't. Natalie managed a weak, "It's complicated," while Zach shrugged and said, "Marriage stuff's tricky." Mike just nodded vaguely, already eyeing the exit. Within minutes, the trio made flimsy excuses. Work, dogs, early mornings, and bolted, leaving Emily stewing and David silent, the tray still dangling in his grip. The backyard emptied out fast after that, the twinkle lights flickering over a scene neither of them could unsee. The burgers were cold, the gin was half gone, and whatever was left of their marriage. It was ash on the grill. Emily woke up the morning after the barbecue with a hangover that felt like a sledgehammer to the skull. The house was eerily quiet. No clatter of David fixing something, no hum of his morning coffee routine. His car was gone from the driveway, his phone went straight to voicemail. "Typical David, making a big scene," she grumbled, popping aspirin and dismissing it as his flair for the dramatic. She figured he'd storm back eventually, tail between his legs, ready to forgive her latest outburst. By the next evening, though, the front door creaked open, and there he was, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a folder tucked under his arm, and a look on his face that said done. David didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He just sat her down at the kitchen table, slid the divorce papers across, and laid it out plain as day. "Last night wasn't just drunk talk, Em," he said, his tone steady but cold. "You don't respect me, you don't respect us. You've been planning to cheat. Maybe not now, but someday. And you see me as a burden." Emily's jaw dropped, but he wasn't finished. "Oh, and I've known about your secret account for 6 months. Tracked every transfer. I've already split our finances. There's enough for 3 months of mortgage. After that, you're on your own." She stared, dumbfounded, as he stood up, grabbed his bag, and walked out, the door clicking shut like a guillotine. She tried to laugh it off at first. "Pfft, it was just party chatter," she stammered to the empty room, rehearsing excuses. But David's words stuck like burrs. She had been chipping away at him for months, maybe years, with her snide remarks and secret rebellions. He'd put up with it, hoping she'd come around, while she'd been too busy painting him as the bad guy to notice. Now he was gone, and the silence in the house was louder than any fight they'd ever had. Emily scrambled to regain some footing. She texted him, "We can talk this out, right?" But got back curt replies about logistics. "Sign the papers. Lawyer's number's on page 2. Even Lindsay, her usually chatty sister, went quiet, dodging calls with vague excuses. "I just think maybe you should think about what you said," Lindsay finally muttered during one awkward exchange, leaving Emily to stew in her own mess. The divorce rolled through few months later. Quick, clean, brutal. They sold the townhouse, split the cash, and that was that. David moved on, steady as ever, while Emily? She burned through her share like it was kindling. The secret fund, her proud little $3,000 stash, vanished first, swallowed by a deposit on a new rental. Then, the house money followed, frittered away on a sleek couch she barely sat on, a designer coat she wore twice, and a parade of overpriced shoes that mocked her from the closet. Now, holed up in a modest apartment with peeling paint and a leaky faucet David would have fixed in 10 minutes, Emily counted every penny of her nurse's paycheck. She'd wanted freedom, control, a life that sparkled. Instead, she'd traded a stable marriage for a stack of bills and a wardrobe she couldn't afford to show off. She'd built this ending herself, brick by stupid brick, and there was no one left to blame. Not David, not Natalie, not even Zach. Just her, alone with the wreckage, wondering how she'd misread the blueprint so badly. 7 months after the divorce, Emily was trailing Natalie through the mall, half listening to her ramble about a sale on boots. Then, across the food court, she spotted him, David, laughing with a woman who wasn't her. She was petite, blonde, and clutching a smoothie, her arm looped through his like they'd invented happiness. Emily froze, nudging Natalie. "Who's that?" she hissed. Natalie, ever the sleuth, craned her neck, eyes gleaming with gossip-fueled glee. "Dunno, but I'll find out." 2 days later, Natalie delivered the scoop over coffee. "Her name's Caitlin, pediatric psychologist. Word is, David bought a new house, big one too, and they're serious." Emily's stomach twisted as Natalie rattled on. "People say he's all attentive with her, like carrying her bags and stuff." The image stung. David, the guy she'd branded a control freak, doting on someone new. She'd seen that side of him once, dinner in the microwave, barbecue lights strung up just for her, and she'd thrown it away like trash. That night, alone in her dim apartment, Emily stared at a pile of overdue bills and a text canceling yet another date. The truth hit like a slap. David had always been caring. She'd just been too selfish, too wrapped up in her own warped expectations to see it. She'd torched their life together, and now he was building a better one without her. Caitlin got the house, the love, the David she'd never deserved. Emily got the silence, and the sinking realization that she'd have to live with it. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.